I Am Born by Charles Dickens. This is an extract from the book David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. The story is about the life of David Copperfield and is told by David himself. David was born in England around the year 1820. His father had died 6 months before he was born. Here he talks about the time just before he was born. His great-aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood, comes to visit his mother for the first time after the death of his father. I was born at Blunderston in Suffolk. My father died 6 months before I was born. Our house was called the Rookery, but there were no rooks about. In the evenings, my mother and I would sit by the fireside in the warm, bright living room. I would sometimes think of my father's white gravestone in the cold, dark churchyard and feel very sad for him. My great-aunt, Miss Betsy Trotwood, was the only person alive on my father's side of the family. She lived alone in a cottage in a small village on the seacoast. My father once was her favourite nephew, but not after he got married. She was angry because he had married a very young woman. My father never saw his Aunt Betsy again. A year after the marriage, my father died. One evening, before I was born, my mother was sitting by the fireside. She looked up and saw a strange lady coming up the garden path. She at once knew that it was Miss Betsy Trotwood, as she had heard about her from my father. Miss Trotwood held herself very straight as she walked up to the house, with a very serious face. Instead of ringing the doorbell, she looked through the window, pressing her nose against the glass. My poor mother was very frightened at this strange behaviour. She got up from her chair at once and stood behind it. Miss Betsy ordered her to let her in, and my mother went to the door. "Mrs. David Copperfield, I think," she said. "You've heard of Miss Trotwood, I'm sure?" "Yes, please come in," said my mother. "Take off your cap, child," said Miss Betsy, "and let me see you." My mother obeyed, and as she did so, her thick, beautiful hair fell all about her face. "Well, bless my heart," exclaimed Miss Betsy. "You're just a baby." My mother looked very young for her age. She hung her head as though it was her fault and began to cry. She thought she felt my aunt touch her hair with her gentle hand. When she looked up, Miss Betsy was seated with her legs stretched out and looking at the fire. "What do you call your girl?" "I don't know whether it'll be a girl," said my mother. "I don't mean that," said my aunt, pointing at my mother. "I mean your servant girl." "Peggotty," said my mother. "Peggotty," replied my aunt. "How on earth did she get such a name?" "It's her surname, madam," said my mother. "Peggotty, could you fetch your mistress some tea?" cried Miss Betsy, going to the door. "She is not well. Hurry." "You were speaking about the child being a girl," said Miss Betsy. "I've no doubt it will be a girl. Now, child, from the time of the birth of this girl—" "Perhaps boy," my mother said. "I tell you it will be a girl," returned Miss Betsy. "From the time of the birth of this girl, I'm going to be her friend. I want to be her godmother. You should call her Betsy Trotwood, Copperfield, and she should be well brought up. Can you keep your accounts and take care of a house?" "Yes, I can." "Not much, but Mr. Copperfield was teaching me." And my mother broke down. No, don't cry any more," said Miss Betsy. "You'll make yourself ill, and that'll be bad for you and the baby. You mustn't do that." This quietened my mother. "What has your husband left you?" asked Miss Betsy a short while later. Mr. Copperfield left me an income of £105 a year, madam, said my mother. Peggotty came in with the tea. She saw how ill my mother looked and sent for the doctor at once. When Mr. Killip, the doctor, and Peggotty took my mother upstairs to her room, Miss Betsy sat in the living room waiting. Hours passed. Mr. Killip came downstairs. He saw Miss Betsy walking up and down the room. "Well, doctor, how is she?" asked Aunt Betsy. "Mrs. Copperfield is quite as comfortable as we can expect a young mother to be. You'll soon be able to see her." "And she? How is she?" said Aunt Betsy. Mr. Killip did not seem to understand. "The baby," said my aunt. "How is she?" "Madam," returned Mr. Killip, "I thought you knew. It's a boy." My aunt did not say a word. She put on her bonnet and walked straight out of the house. She never came back again. And that was how I, David Copperfield, was born.